Sherlock Holmes and the Adventure of the Midnight Visitor. From the private papers of John H. Watson, M.D. Author's note. Found among Dr. Watson's private papers, this account was marked for future publication when the world is ready for certain truths. Along with the manuscript were several samples of curious crystalline structures, and a partial monograph by Sherlock Holmes on the properties of temporal mechanics, though the latter appears to have been damaged by exposure to what Holmes's notes described as residual temporal energy. Prologue. A Night of Wonder. There are nights in London when the fog rolls in so thick that even the most rational of minds might believe in magic. On this particular Christmas Eve in 1895, the usual grey mists had given way to something far more remarkable: snow, falling in great silent flicks that transformed the city's grimy streets into something from a fairy tale. High above the sleeping city, in the bell tower of St. Paul's Cathedral, the great clock struck midnight, its chimes muffled by the blanket of white that covered all of London. In that same moment, though no one was there to witness it, a shadow passed across the face of the moon, a shadow that, had anyone been watching, might have appeared to be pulled by 8 tiny shapes. But of course, no sensible Londoner would ever admit to seeing such a thing. After all, this was the modern age, an age of science and reason, where every mystery had its logical explanation, or so Sherlock Holmes would have said. Chapter 1. The Curious Visitor. It should be noted that I have taken great care in assembling this account, drawing not only from my own direct observations, but also from Holmes's subsequent detailed explanations, Kringle's clarifications about certain magical principles, and technical insights about their remarkable equipment. Where I describe events I did not personally witness, I have relied on these impeccable sources, though I confess that even now, years later, certain aspects of that remarkable night still challenge my understanding of what is possible. "My dear Watson," said Sherlock Holmes, standing at the frost-etched window of 221B Baker Street, "you really must stop fidgeting with that parcel. The contents will not become any less breakable through your constant attention, though I suspect the paper may not survive your ministrations." The clock had just struck 9, its chimes muffled by the thick snowfall outside. I started, guilty of exactly the nervous habit my friend had observed. The package in question, a delicate glass chemistry set I had purchased for Holmes as a Christmas gift, had indeed begun to show signs of wear at its corners. "Really, Holmes," I protested, setting the parcel aside, "must you deduce your own Christmas presents? It rather spoils the spirit of the thing." Holmes turned from the window, and I caught the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his thin lips. He was dressed, as always, in his mouse-coloured dressing-gown, though the season had prompted the addition of a thick wool scarf about his neck. "My dear fellow, I have not deduced the specific contents, merely their general nature. The sound of glass clicking against glass when you walked in, combined with your decision to visit that rather specialized shop in Covent Garden last Tuesday — the receipt is still visible in your coat pocket, by the way — suggests something in the realm of scientific equipment. Given the season and your perpetual concern about my tendency to grow restless without case—" He trailed off, distracted by something in the street below. I rose from my chair by the fire and joined him at the window, curious about what could have caught his attention so completely. "How peculiar," he murmured, more to himself than to me. Below, the usual traffic of Baker Street moved through the freshly fallen snow, leaving trails of carriage wheels and hoofprints in the pristine white. But it was not these ordinary marks that had captured Holmes's interest. There, cutting across the regular patterns of London traffic, was a single line of footprints that seemed to begin in the middle of the street and end abruptly at our very doorstep. Most curious of all, where the gas lamp's light caught them, the prints appeared to sparkle with an inner luminescence that defied the natural properties of snow. "You see them, Watson?" Holmes asked, his keen eyes narrowing. "Those prints could not have been made more than 10 minutes ago, yet I observed no one making them. More curious still is their nature. The left boot shows signs of recent repair work, done in a most unusual style. I have only encountered once before, in a case involving a toy maker from Munich. And observe how they glitter, Watson, as though dusted with frost that refuses to melt despite the relative warmth of the street." Before I could respond, we were interrupted by the sound of Mrs. Hudson's rapid footsteps on the stairs, quite different from her usual measured tread. Through the heavy oak door I could hear the unfamiliar jingling of small bells accompanying her ascent. "Yes, Mr. Holmes!" she called, her voice carrying an unusual note of excitement. "Mr. Holmes, you have a visitor, and I must say—" She paused, seemingly at a loss for words, which was most unlike our stalwart landlady. Holmes raised an eyebrow, his interest clearly piqued. "Show them up, Mrs. Hudson," he said, already moving to take his accustomed place by the fire. "It seems our quiet Christmas Eve is about to become considerably more interesting." As Mrs. Hudson's footsteps retreated, Holmes quickly donned his coat, a sign he expected to be heading out shortly. "You may wish to keep your outdoor gear close at hand, Watson," he said, his eyes bright with anticipation. "Unless I am very much mistaken, we are about to encounter a case that will challenge not only my powers of deduction, but perhaps our very understanding of what is possible." The sound of heavy boots on the 17 steps up to our lodgings made us both turn toward the door. The footsteps were measured, deliberate, and accompanied by that same curious jingling sound I had noted moments before. Holmes had gone very still, his head cocked slightly to one side in that familiar pose that meant he was already deep in the process of deduction. The door opened to reveal one of the most remarkable figures I have ever beheld in our sitting room at Baker Street. The man who entered was of impressive girth, though he carried his bulk with surprising grace. His face was almost entirely hidden behind a thick white beard that showed signs of being wind-blown, and his cheeks and nose were reddened as if by long exposure to extreme cold. Though he wore a rather ordinary brown travelling coat, the boots that had left those mysterious prints were clearly visible, magnificent things of supple leather, worked with designs I had never before encountered. "Mr. Holmes," the stranger said in a voice that somehow managed to be both jolly and urgent at once, "I must beg your immediate assistance in a matter of the gravest importance." He paused, glancing at me with twinkling eyes that seemed to hold secrets. "Dr. Watson may of course remain, as I am familiar with his discretion in recording your cases." Chapter 2. The Impossible Problem. Holmes had not moved from his position by the fire, but I could see from the slight tilt of his head that he was in the full flow of his deductive powers. "Pray take a seat," he said, gesturing to the client's chair, "though I suspect you have little time to waste, given that you must complete your deliveries by dawn." Our visitor started violently. "How could you possibly—" "Elementary," Holmes interrupted, a rare smile playing at his lips. "Your boots, as I mentioned to Watson moments ago, bear the distinctive craftsmanship of a particular toy maker in Munich. Or rather, they were made by someone who learned their trade from that same craftsman. The leather is scored in a pattern I have seen only once before, but your boots show signs of much more extensive wear in extreme conditions. The residue of snow on your coat is not from our London weather. It has a different crystalline structure. It has a far more northerly origin." Our visitor settled his considerable bulk into the chair, which creaked ominously. "Go on," he said, his eyes twinkling with what seemed to be genuine delight, despite his obvious distress. "Your beard, while natural, shows signs of having been exposed to high-speed winds very recently, despite the relatively calm London weather. There are threads on your coat cuff of a wool that does not come from any sheep I am familiar with, possibly reindeer, though I would need to consult my monograph on Northern European textiles to be certain. Most telling, however, is the empty sack protruding from your coat pocket. The material is of remarkable construction, and the way it is folded suggests it can hold far more than its apparent size would indicate." "Remarkable!" our visitor exclaimed. "Though I should not be surprised given your reputation, Mr. Holmes. You are quite correct on all counts, and I find myself even more convinced that you are the only one who can help me. I am known by many names, but you may call me Kris Kringle, and I have had something stolen from me, something without which Christmas itself may fail to arrive this year." Holmes leaned forward in his chair, his keen eyes bright with interest. "Tell me everything, Mr. Kringle, and pray be precise. When exactly did you notice the theft?" "It was precisely at 7 o'clock this evening, North Pole time," Mr. Kringle began, pulling out a peculiar timepiece that seemed to show multiple times at once. The device itself was a marvel of craftsmanship, with several faces showing different times and what appeared to be astronomical calculations running around its rim. "I was making my final preparations for tonight's journey when I discovered that the Star of Christmas had been taken from its place of safekeeping." Before proceeding further, Kringle reached into his coat, producing a small velvet pouch that seemed to shimmer in the lamplight. "Temporal displacement powder," he explained, noting our curious expressions. "My engineers have refined it specifically for situations like this. A circle of it around any temporal disturbance will stabilize the local time stream." "The Star of Christmas?" I interjected, unable to contain my curiosity. "A device of, unusual properties," our visitor replied carefully. Without it, I cannot accomplish my deliveries in the time required. You see, Mr. Holmes, time itself behaves differently on Christmas Eve, or rather, we have learned to work with certain temporal peculiarities that occur naturally on this night. The star helps us navigate these peculiarities." Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin, a gesture I knew well from our previous cases. "And you suspect a specific culprit?" "Indeed, Mr. Holmes. I have reason to believe it was taken by a man you know well, a Professor James Moriarty." At the mention of that name, Holmes's face grew sharp with intensity. "Moriarty," he breathed almost to himself. "Yes, of course. Only he would dare, and only he would understand how to use it." He sprang to his feet with sudden energy. "Watson, get your revolver. Mr. Kringle, you are followed here, not by Moriarty himself, but by one of his agents. We have precisely 3 hours before he attempts to use the star, and we must act quickly." As I moved to retrieve my weapon, I noticed something extraordinary. Where Mr. Kringle's boots had left snow upon our carpet, the flakes remained pristine, glittering with an inner light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the timepiece he held. Looking at Holmes, I wondered if he too had observed this phenomenon, but his face showed only the keen concentration I knew so well from our previous adventures. "We'll need to move quickly," Kringle said, rising from his chair with surprising agility. "I have transportation arranged, though I should warn you it may challenge your understanding of what's possible." "My dear Mr. Kringle," Holmes replied, a rare smile playing at his lips, "I have always maintained that when you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Shall we proceed to the roof?" Chapter 3. To the Rooftops. We made our way to the roof via the narrow stairs that led to Mrs. Hudson's rarely used attic. As Holmes picked the lock with practised ease, we had never been given a key to this particular door, the jingling above grew louder, accompanied by the sort of snuffling and stamping one might expect from ordinary horses, though these were clearly anything but ordinary. The sight that greeted us as we emerged onto the snow-covered roof of 221B Baker Street is one that I shall never forget, though I doubt any reader will fully believe my account. There, tethered to our chimney stack by ribbons of softly glowing light, stood 8 reindeer, their coats gleaming with what appeared to be starlight rather than snow behind them. Seeming to hover slightly above the roof tiles was a sleigh of such magnificent craftsmanship that even Holmes let out a soft whistle of appreciation. "North Pole oak," he murmured, running a hand along the polished wood. "Grown in complete darkness, except for the aurora borealis. The grain patterns are unmistakable. And these runners—" He crouched to examine them more closely. "Some form of self-adjusting meteorological adaptation system, I presume. Cribbed from the Passion Varia." As Holmes completed his examination, a curious sight caught my eye. A diminutive figure, no taller than 6 inches, materialized from behind one of the reindeer's antlers. The being was dressed in an emerald-green uniform, trimmed with gold, complete with pointed boots and a cap adorned with a silver bell. "Miss Alabaster Snowbell, Master Engineer and Head of Security Operations. At your service," the tiny figure announced, with a crisp military bearing that seemed at odds with her size. "And you're quite right about the runners, Mr. Holmes. My own design, incorporating enchanted silver from the Aurora mines." Holmes, to his credit, merely raised an eyebrow, his equivalent of profound surprise. "Ah, the crystalline patterns in the metal suggested something of the sort, though I confess the method of molecular bonding escapes my current understanding." "Holmes," I whispered, "surely you can't be taking this all in your stride? That is, "An elf, Dr. Watson," Miss Snowbell supplied helpfully, now hovering at eye level with us. "And I assure you, your friend's reputation for observation is well deserved. Few humans notice the Aurora Silver's distinctive properties on first inspection." "The refinements can wait, Mr. Holmes," Kringle said, climbing aboard with practised ease. "We have precisely 2 hours and 43 minutes before Moriarty's temporal intersection reaches critical alignment." As we settled into the sleigh, which was far more spacious inside than its exterior dimensions would suggest, I noticed Holmes examining every detail with the same intensity he usually reserved for crime scenes. His fingers traced patterns in the woodwork that seemed to shift and change under his touch, and I saw him pocket a small sample of what appeared to be snow from one of the reindeer's hoofs. "I should warn you," Kringle said, taking up the reins, "this mode of travel can be a bit—" The rest of his words were lost as the sleigh suddenly shot upward into the night sky with such acceleration that I found myself pressed back against the seat. Holmes naturally had his notebook out already, attempting to calculate our velocity based on the rate at which London shrank below us. "Remarkable!" he shouted over the wind. "The atmospheric displacement should be catastrophic at this speed, yet we appear to be travelling in some sort of localized temporal bubble. Mr. Kringle, the implications for physics alone—" "Time enough for science later, old fellow," I interrupted, noting the growing collection of lights around Clerkenwell. "I believe we're approaching our destination." Below us, in a pattern that would have been invisible from the ground, 5 of London's greatest timepieces had begun to glow with an unnatural blue light. At the centre of their star-shaped arrangement, the chronometrous building's clock face pulsed with increasing intensity. The building itself, a masterpiece of Victorian engineering that rose above Clerkenwell like a cathedral to time itself, seemed to shimmer in and out of focus as we approached. Chapter 4. A Matter of Time. 7 minutes until complete alignment, Holmes muttered, consulting both his pocket watch and the curious timepiece Kringle had shown us earlier. See how the temporal distortions are already affecting the surrounding area. He was right. The snow around the tower fell upward now, and I could see people on the streets below moving as if through treacle, their motions slow and dreamlike. Others seemed to skip forward in space, appearing and disappearing like figures in a magic lantern show. The effect extended in a perfect circle around the chronometer's building, its radius precisely matching the distance to each of the other temple points. Moriarty's devices at the other points, Miss Snowbell explained, hovering near the edge of our rooftop vantage point. They're creating a temporal lens. Once it focuses, the star will amplify it exponentially, Holmes finished, creating not just a fold in time, but a tear. He turned to Kringle. That's what you feared, isn't it? Not just the theft of your abilities, but the complete disruption of time itself. Our rotund companion nodded grimly, his usual jolly demeanor replaced by deep concern. If he succeeds, it won't just be Christmas that's affected. Time itself will become unstable throughout London, perhaps even beyond. Then we must split up, Holmes declared, his voice taking on the crisp tone of command I knew so well. Watson, you and Snowbell take the temporal displacement powder to the Greenwich clock tower. Break that point of the star, and the alignment will be disrupted. Mr. Kringle, I suspect you'll be needed at St. Paul's, where the temporal distortion appears strongest. I shall deal with Moriarty myself. Holmes, I protested, surely you don't mean to face him alone? A thin smile crossed my friend's face. My dear Watson, while I appreciate your concern, I believe I'm uniquely qualified for this particular confrontation. After all, he patted his coat pocket where I knew he kept his monograph on the interpretation of temporal anomalies in criminal investigations. I have made something of a study of the unusual. Kringle reached into his coat and produced what appeared to be a small bell. For emergencies only, Mr. Holmes. Ring it once, and time will pause, shall we say? But be warned, its effects are brief, and it will only work once. As we prepared to separate, Miss Snowbell adjusted her flying apparatus, a curious contraption of gossamer wings and tiny silver gears. I can guide Dr. Watson to Greenwich through the temporal disturbances, she said. The elfin way of flight is somewhat more stable in these conditions. From our position on the neighbouring rooftop, we could clearly observe the observation deck of the chronometer's building, where Moriarty had established his apparatus. 5 brass telescopes pointed precisely at the other towers of his temporal star, each connected to a central mechanism that hummed with an otherworldly energy. The star of Christmas sat at its heart, its crystalline structure seeming to bend light around itself in impossible ways. The time variance is increasing exponentially, Miss Snowbell observed, consulting a delicate silver instrument from her uniform pocket. We have perhaps 15 minutes before the temporal intersection becomes irreversible. Then we must act now, Holmes said firmly. Watson, you know what to do. Mr. Kringle, the star's natural resonance should help you disrupt the St. Paul's node. I shall reason with Moriarty. The way he said those last words sent a familiar chill down my spine. I had heard that tone before, in cases where my friend faced his most dangerous adversaries. Yet something in his manner suggested that this time he held knowledge that even Moriarty had not anticipated. Chapter 5. The Confrontation. The events which followed were later related to me by Holmes, though I have attempted to record them here with my usual fidelity to detail. From my position at Greenwich, I could observe much of what transpired, as the temporal distortions made the very air above London transparent at times, like layers of crystal overlapping. The wind at this height whipped at Holmes's coat as he climbed, his keen eyes noting every detail of the clock tower's construction. The temporal distortions grew stronger with each step. Here, a rung of the ladder that seemed to exist in two places at once. There, a section where his hand passed through solid metal as if it were no more substantial than London fog. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Moriarty's voice drifted down. "The mathematics of it, Holmes. Pure, perfect equations that allow one to step outside time itself." Holmes pulled himself onto the observation platform, noting the complex array of astronomical equipment Moriarty had assembled. "Elegant," Holmes admitted, straightening his coat, "though your calculations fail to account for one critical variable." Moriarty stood at the centre of his apparatus, the Star of Christmas held aloft in one hand. Up close, the artifact appeared deceptively simple, a crystalline structure that seemed to bend light around itself in impossible ways. It pulsed in time with the great clock below them, each beat sending ripples through the fabric of reality. "You always did have a tendency to overestimate your own cleverness, Holmes," Moriarty said, his thin lips curving in a smile. "What variable could I possibly have overlooked?" "The inherent nature of belief," Holmes replied, taking a careful step forward. "You've approached this as a purely mathematical problem. But consider, why does Mr. Kringle's system work only on Christmas Eve? Why not simply choose any night when the stars are in alignment? Around them, time continued to distort. Holmes observed with fascination as a flock of birds flew backward across the London sky, while the hands of Big Ben in the distance spun like a Catherine wheel. "Belief is irrelevant," Moriarty scoffed. "The star operates on purely scientific principles. Once I complete the alignment—" "Does it?" Holmes interrupted, his voice sharp. "Then explain the crystalline structure. I've made a study of mineralogy, as you know. That star follows no natural pattern of formation. It exists because children believe it exists. The same principle that allows 8 reindeer to defy gravity and a single man to visit every home in one night. From my position near the Greenwich clock tower, I could clearly observe St. Paul's Cathedral glowing with an intense blue light as Kringle worked to disrupt Moriarty's devices. Miss Snowbell and I had just completed our own task, surrounding the Greenwich temporal anchor with a circle of displacement powder that sparked and shimmered as it disrupted the unnatural energies. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Moriarty's face. The star's pulsing became erratic, its light fluctuating wildly. "You're trying to distract me," the professor snarled. "The alignment is nearly complete. In moments, I will have control over time itself." "Look at your readings," Holmes insisted, gesturing to the nearest telescope. "The temporal field is already destabilizing. You cannot force belief to follow mathematical laws, Professor. The more you try to reduce it to pure logic." A violent shudder ran through the tower. Far below, the great clock began to toll, each strike coming at irregular intervals. The star in Moriarty's hand flared brilliantly, causing both men to shield their eyes. "What's happening?" Moriarty demanded, struggling to maintain his grip on the artifact. "The calculations were perfect." "Were they?" Holmes asked quietly, reaching for the small bell in his pocket. "Or did you fail to account for the most powerful force of all, the simple faith of a child on Christmas Eve?" The star's light had become almost unbearable now, and with it came a sound, distant at first, but growing stronger, the clear, bright sound of children's laughter, mixing with the toll of bells from every church in London. "No!" Moriarty shouted as his devices began to spark and fail. "I will not be undone by fairy tales and children's stories." He thrust the star higher, its light blazing with renewed intensity. "The temporal field can still be stabilized. I need only..." But Holmes had already rung Kringle's bell. The clear, pure tone cut through all other sounds, and for one impossible moment, time itself seemed to hold its breath. At this precise instant, every clock in London struck midnight simultaneously, regardless of what time they had previously shown. The star flared one final time, and then, rather than the catastrophic temporal collapse Moriarty had intended, it began to sing. There is no other word for the pure, crystalline tone that emanated from it, a sound that reminded me somehow of fresh snow and children's laughter and the hush of Christmas Eve, all at once. Moriarty screamed in frustration as the star lifted itself from his grasp, floating gently toward Holmes like a soap bubble on the wind. My friend plucked it from the air with the same precise grace he might employ to handle a delicate piece of evidence. "A simple matter of understanding one's subject," Holmes remarked, studying the star with evident fascination. "You see, Professor, there is a logic to magic, but it is the logic of dreams and wishes, not differential equations." The sleigh descended through the swirling snow, Kringle handling the reins with expert precision despite the lingering temporal distortions in the air. Miss Snowbell and I had arrived moments before, and I could see the satisfaction in her expression as she observed the perfectly executed plan. "I don't suppose," Holmes said to Moriarty, who stood grimly among his failed apparatus, "that you would care to explain how you first discovered the star's existence? Purely for the sake of completing my monograph on the incident, you understand." Before Moriarty could respond, there was a sharp crack and a flash of green light. When it faded, the professor had vanished, though a trail of footprints in the snow led to the tower's edge and down into the London fog below. "He'll have used one of his emergency temporal devices," Kringle said as he brought the sleigh to rest beside the platform. "A crude copy of the star's power, good for one jump only, though I doubt we've seen the last of him." Epilogue: A Christmas Mystery. As the final bells of midnight faded, I observed a curious phenomenon. All across London, timepieces that had been drawn into Moriarty's temporal manipulations simply settled. Like ripples smoothing on a pond, time restored itself to its proper flow. When I later consulted various clockmakers and chronometer specialists throughout the city, none reported any disruption to their instruments. Holmes turned to Kringle, whose broad face beamed with pleasure. "One question, if I may," he asked, his notebook already in hand. "The method by which you achieve simultaneous delivery to multiple households, does it involve quantum superposition or merely localized temporal loops?" "Holmes," I interrupted, noting the first light of dawn beginning to creep into the eastern sky, "perhaps some mysteries are better left unsolved?" To my surprise, my logical friend actually laughed. "My dear Watson, you may be right, though I suspect—" He paused, looking thoughtfully at the star of Christmas, which now glowed with a warm, steady light. "I suspect that understanding a mystery and preserving its wonder need not be mutually exclusive." As Kringle's sleigh lifted once more into the night sky, Holmes and I made our way down the tower's maintenance ladder. The city's clocks had returned to their proper rhythm, and the temporal distortions had faded like morning mist. "I don't suppose," I ventured as we reached the street, "that you'll be including this case in your scientific publications?" "Perhaps not," Holmes admitted, though he was still making notes in his pocketbook. "Though I may need to revise certain chapters of my monograph on the limits of possible phenomena. After all, Watson," he added, pulling his collar up against the cold, "there is nothing more damaging to scientific progress than assuming we have discovered all there is to know." As we walked back toward Baker Street through the freshly fallen snow, I could have sworn I heard the distant sound of sleigh bells and children's laughter on the wind. Holmes, I noticed, was smiling slightly as he walked, and his pocket notebook remained closed for the rest of our journey home.